While other children play in manicured gardens or sip cocoa under crystal chandeliers, Emily and Sophie Harrington, two silent twins wrapped in pink dresses, are led into a dusty stable by Clara Johnson, a woman scarred by hardship but armed with fierce love. Their father, Samuel Harrington, a millionaire drowning in grief since his wife's death, believes his daughters have everything they could ever need until he returns early one day and sees the unthinkable. Instead of sulking in marble halls, his girls are knee-deep in straw, laughing. Emily shouts, "Daddy, look, I can do it," as she lifts a shovel twice her size. Sophie giggles when a horse nibbles at her braid, whispering, "It tickles." The barn, once filled with silence, erupts with joy. Samuel's voice cracks the air, furious. "They are my daughters, Clara!" Not servants. But Clara doesn't flinch. She steps forward, her dark eyes steady. "Do you want them to be perfect dolls in a glass case, Samuel, or children who know what it means to truly live?" For the first time, the tycoon falters. His pride collides with the sight of his daughters clinging to him, tears in their eyes. Emily pulls his sleeve. "Daddy, please." "I've never been this happy," Sophie adds, her voice trembling but strong. "Let us stay. Just one day." And in that moment, Samuel's shoulders collapse. The shovel slips from his hand. He kneels in the straw, laughter breaking free like a man reborn. "All right," he whispers, choking back emotion. "Show me how." The twins beam, guiding his hands as straw flies into the air like golden confetti. The mansion had never given them this but love, dirt, and one fearless woman did. Support us by subscribing and share in the comments. Where are you listening to this story of resilience tonight? The Kentucky countryside spread beneath a restless autumn sky, clouds bruised with gray and hints of violet as the late afternoon sun fought its way down through thin streaks of gold. A cool wind carried the smell of damp earth and horse hay from farms tucked away beyond the tree line. The two-lane road was narrow, its asphalt cracked in places where weeds had dared to climb through, and dust rose behind any car that dared to hurry past. Yet on this day, only one car disturbed the silence. A black Mercedes sedan gliding steadily, its polished frame collecting flecks of rural grit. Behind the wheel sat Samuel Harrington, a man whose very presence carried the weight of success and solitude. Samuel was 51, tall and broad-shouldered, though softened now by years behind boardroom tables rather than construction sites. His hair, once a rich walnut brown, had silvered at the temples, lending him the air of seasoned dignity. His face was angular, carved by long hours of frowning at contracts and scanning blueprints, the faint lines on his brow evidence of both discipline and regret. He was a millionaire real estate investor who had built half a dozen luxury developments across Chicago and Louisville. To the world, Samuel was decisive, formidable, a man who rarely wasted words. But since the passing of his wife, Margaret, 3 years ago, silence had become his truest companion. Those close enough to notice whispered that he had grown colder, less willing to laugh, less capable of warmth. What mattered to him now were numbers, expansions, and the ceaseless grind of deals, at least. That was what he allowed others to believe. He had ended his Chicago business trip earlier than expected, the negotiation with a stubborn partner concluding in his favor. Ordinarily, Samuel would have merged onto the interstate, let the long, clean stretch of highway escort him back to his mansion in Lexington. But a sudden impulse guided his hand to turn the wheel at an unfamiliar junction, steering the Mercedes toward the narrow county road. Perhaps it was fatigue from endless concrete skylines, perhaps a subconscious yearning for open air and fields. Either way, the road unfolded like a forgotten story waiting to be told. The countryside here felt almost suspended in time. Weather-worn barns leaned on themselves, wooden fences rattled faintly against the wind, and the land rolled out in quilted greens and browns stitched with creeks. Samuel adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at the dashboard clock, and muttered, "Another hour at most." Yet beneath his composed exterior, curiosity flickered. Curiosity that often led him to profitable properties, but on this day, toward something far more personal. It was on one such bend, where where sycamore trees arched low and cast their web of shadows, that he slowed. Ahead, a figure moved with steady grace, her posture erect against the slant of the breeze. Beside her skipped two small girls in matching pink dresses, their ribbons tangled in the air. Samuel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He knew that silhouette. Clara Johnson. Clara had worked in his home for nearly 2 years, originally hired as a maid after Margaret's passing, then asked, almost begged by Samuel's exhausted staff to serve as nanny to his daughters. Clara was in her early 30s, tall with a presence that demanded attention without ever raising her voice. Her skin was a deep and luminous ebony, catching the light in warm tones of mahogany. She wore her hair cropped short, neat curls framing a face defined by sharp cheekbones and a gaze that carried both strength and a quiet sorrow. Clara had been raised on a modest horse farm not far from here, daughter to a groomer who died too young and a mother who worked herself ragged in a textile mill. Life had hardened her, but not into bitterness, rather into resilience. She was fiercely protective of children, though beneath her disciplined calm lived a woman scarred by loss. Years ago, her younger brother had drowned in a river during a summer outing, a tragedy that instilled in her a conviction that children must be watched, guided, and loved before danger or despair could claim them. Clara was not soft in her methods, at least not in the way other nannies had been. She set rules, spoke firmly, and never hesitated to assign chores that seemed beneath the silk and satin world of Samuel's daughters. And though Samuel respected her dedication, he had often thought her too intense, too far removed from the coddling environment the twins had known since birth. The twins, Emily and Sophie Harrington, were now walking beside her. At 5 years old, they looked almost like mirror images, delicate frames, pale blonde hair falling in fine waves to their shoulders, and round hazel eyes that seemed perpetually shadowed with melancholy. Their cheeks should have been plump with laughter, yet too often they were hollowed by silence. In the mansion, they rarely laughed, rarely smiled. They wandered through marble halls like two small ghosts draped in pink lace. Their mother's absence lingered over them like a veil, and though Samuel hired tutors, therapists, and endless caretakers, nothing pierced the gloom. Staff referred to them privately as the sorrowful princesses. They were shy around strangers, clinging to each other rather than seeking new friends, speaking in hushed voices as though afraid of waking some unseen spirit in the house. But now Samuel blinked twice to be sure there was something different. Though Emily's steps were hesitant and Sophie clutched a small stuffed rabbit against her chest, neither child appeared miserable. Their expressions carried confusion, yes, perhaps even a glimmer of anxiety, but not the familiar weight of despair. They were outside in the dust of a country road under Clara's watchful eye, and they were not breaking apart. For the first time in what felt like years, Samuel sensed possibility rather than doom in their presence. He pulled the Mercedes to the side of the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The engine hummed low as he shifted into park, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. The air smelled faintly of manure and clover, and a hawk circled overhead, crying sharply into the fading day. Samuel remained still, hands on the wheel, his chest tightening. He had never permitted Clara to take the girls out of the city without notice. What was she doing here? And why, in this unlikely setting, did they seem less like porcelain dolls and more like children? Emily spotted the black car first. Her small fingers tugged at Clara's sleeve. Sophie whispered something inaudible, her eyes wide. Clara turned, recognizing the vehicle immediately. Her face did not harden in guilt nor soften in apology. Instead, her eyes narrowed with the calm of someone who had expected confrontation eventually. She guided the girls to the side of the road, resting a protective hand on each of their shoulders. From behind the tinted glass, Samuel studied them. Clara's stance was steady, unafraid. Emily bit her lip. Sophie buried her nose against the rabbit, but neither dissolved into tears. Something about that struck Samuel harder than he anticipated. His daughters were not cowering. They were coping. He reached for the door handle, but stopped. 1,000 thoughts clashed within him. indignation at Clara's independence, worry for the girl's safety, and an odd stirring of admiration. His late wife's voice flickered in memory. "They need more than velvet rooms, Sam. They need to live, even if it's messy." The countryside stretched quiet around him, no other cars, no eyes to witness. Only the rustle of leaves and the small, steady breaths of his daughters carried across the road. Samuel exhaled deeply, his jaw clenched, his pulse uneven. For the first time in years, the empire builder found himself at a loss for words. He remained in the car, silently observing, unwilling to shatter whatever fragile transformation had begun on this dusty Kentucky road. And so he lingered, a man of wealth and silence, staring through the glass at a woman of conviction and two girls in pink who might be learning how to smile again. 2 days before Samuel Harrington's Mercedes slowed on the Kentucky back road, Clara Johnson had stood in the marble foyer of the Lexington mansion, watching the twins shuffle across the cold tiles in their identical dresses. The house felt more like a mausoleum than a home, grand staircases curving like frozen rivers, chandeliers shimmering without warmth, and portraits of stern ancestors gazing down with indifferent eyes. Emily clutched her stuffed rabbit. Sophie dragged the hem of her dress against the floor, and both girls wore the same hollow expression Clara had grown to recognize, the look of children trapped in glass. She knew she had to do something before their sorrow calcified into something permanent. Clara's decision had been shaped by the memory of her own childhood. The farm she grew up on was nothing grand, a modest spread of pasture land outside Shelbyville, where the smell of hay mingled with the sweat of her father's labor. He had been a quiet man, tall and wiry, with calloused hands and a laugh that came rarely but rang honest when it did. When he passed suddenly of a heart attack, Clara's mother had been left to keep the farm afloat, and Clara, only 13, had learned to shovel stalls, haul buckets, and tend to horses with tears drying on her cheeks. Those years had hardened her shoulders but softened her heart. She learned that sorrow could be carried, but it could also be worked through, transformed into resilience by sweat and purpose. And now, looking at Emily and Sophie, she saw echoes of her younger self before she had discovered that lesson. That afternoon, she packed a modest bag, a change of clothes for each child, and tucked their essentials into the back of her old Ford pickup. The twins were confused, questioning her softly, but Clara only said, "We're going to see a place where the air feels different." They had never been away from the mansion without their father or a driver. They protested faintly, but Clara's steady hand and calm eyes reassured them more than her words. They drove out of the city, the skyscrapers fading into rolling fields, the girls' small faces pressed against the window glass as though watching another world unfold. The farm appeared at the end of a gravel drive framed by sagging fences. The barn roof was rusted in patches, and the house white once, now peeling, sat proud despite its wear. Clara had left it in the care of her cousin, Ruth Miller, a woman in her 40s with a frame hardened by work. Ruth was of medium height, broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked silver and a face both plain and kind. She had never married, preferring the company of horses to people, but loneliness had etched faint lines around her eyes. Still, her voice carried warmth, and when she saw Clara climb out of the truck with two pale, wide-eyed girls in pink, Ruth wiped her hands on her jeans and smiled. "So, these are the little doves," she said. The girls stared back, unsure whether to trust her, but Clara felt the tension ease slightly in their shoulders. The farm wasn't silent. It breathed with the sounds of life. Chickens clucked near the coop, a dog barked somewhere distant, and from the barn came the muffled snort of a horse. The animal stepped into view moments later. Duke, a bay gelding well into his 20s with a grizzled muzzle and eyes the color of old amber. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, scarred along one flank from a youthful accident with barbed wire. Once a proud workhorse, now semi-retired, Duke was steady, patient, and gentle enough for children to approach. Emily and Sophie instinctively drew closer to Clara at the sight of him, but Clara crouched, resting her hands on their shoulders. "He won't hurt you. He's older than me in horse years. See? He's just curious." Duke lowered his head, breathing warm air over Sophie's dress, and for a brief second, Sophie's lips twitched toward a smile. But the barn itself, when Clara led them inside, broke their fragile calm. The air was thick with the smell of hay, manure, and leather. Dust motes swirled in shafts of light cutting down through the slats. Flies buzzed lazily, horses shifted in their stalls, hooves clinking against the wooden planks. Emily pinched her nose, Sophie buried her face in her rabbit, and both girls whined in unison. "It stinks!" Emily cried. "I don't want to be here," Sophie echoed, her small voice trembling. Their eyes glistened with the beginnings of tears. Clara didn't scold them, nor did she rush to comfort them. Instead, she knelt so her eyes were level with theirs, her voice steady as stone. "Girls, you've been given so much. Toys, dresses, rooms bigger than this whole barn. But none of it has brought you joy, has it? You carry sadness like heavy coats. Do you know what lifted my sadness when I was your age? This." She gestured to the stalls, to the hay, to the horse shifting its weight nearby. "It doesn't look pretty, it doesn't smell sweet. But it's real, and real things have a way of making us laugh even when we think we never will again." Emily shook her head. Sophie clutched tighter at the rabbit, but Clara pressed on, her voice gentler now. "You will not understand true smiles if you've never been willing to get dirty. A little dust, a little mud. It's the price of knowing what it means to be alive." She stood and reached for a rake, placing it into Emily's small hands. "Help me with this." Just once Emily frowned, shaking under the weight, but Clara placed her hand over the child's, steadying her. Sophie, not to be left out, took a smaller bucket, reluctantly offered by Ruth, and so the first resistance cracked into reluctant effort. Still, the struggle was real. Emily gagged when a shovel scraped manure into a wheelbarrow. Sophie complained of splinters from the old bucket handle. They pouted, whimpered, even stomped their shoes against the straw. Yet Clara did not relent. She hummed a tune her mother used to sing, a slow, gospel rhythm that filled the barn with something steadier than their protests. Ruth brought them cups of water, Duke snorted from his stall, and the work, though clumsy, continued. Slowly, a rhythm took shape. Emily tried to mimic Clara's motions with the rake, stumbling but laughing faintly when hay flew into her sister's hair. Sophie spilled half her bucket but giggled when a chicken darted past her feet. Clara caught the sound light, tentative but unmistakably laughter, and her heart tightened. It was the first time she had heard it from them. That evening, as the sun bled into crimson across the horizon, Clara guided the twins out to the porch of the farmhouse. Ruth cooked beans and cornbread inside, the smell carrying out to the night air. Fireflies blinked across the fields, and the girls sat shoulder to shoulder, their dresses smudged, their hands still faintly dirty despite washing. Sophie whispered, "It's not so bad," and Emily nodded solemnly, clutching the stuffed rabbit with less desperation than before. Clara wrapped an arm around both of them, silent, letting the moment breathe. They didn't know it yet, but the farm had already begun its quiet work on their sorrow. The sun rose with reluctant grace over the Kentucky farmland, spreading a soft amber wash across the fields. Mist clung stubbornly to the low ground, as though it did not wish to release the night, and the barn stood there like an old soldier weathered by duty, yet unwilling to bow. Its roof bore rusted scars, and its red planks had dulled with time, but the building still hummed with a kind of strength functional, dependable, unpretentious. On this morning, the Harrington twins would meet its truth not as distant onlookers, but as small workers asked to give of themselves. Clara Johnson had risen earlier than anyone, long before dawn, the way farm-bred souls often did. She had checked on the animals, scattered feed for the hens, and brushed the dust from Duke's bay coat, while whispering to him the same half-prayer she had whispered since girlhood. "Another day, old boy." Let's make it count. Clara was 32, her frame long and sure, built less for elegance than for perseverance. Her deep brown skin carried the sheen of effort, her dark eyes contained wells of unspoken history, and the clipped curls around her face spoke of practicality. Years of grief and labor had not broken her. They had refined her like iron in fire. This morning she wore denim faded at the knees, boots scuffed to honesty, and a quiet determination in her shoulders. The two girls entrusted to her care would resist, perhaps cry, perhaps turn stubborn, but she would stand her ground. They needed this more than they knew. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, Ruth Miller, Clara's cousin and caretaker of the homestead, busied herself with the skillet. Ruth was solid in stature, late 40s, her hair a thick braid laced with silver, her eyes soft despite the lines of fatigue around them. Life had pressed her into a figure that carried both endurance and kindness. She hummed an old hymn as she scrambled eggs, then turned with a smile when Emily and Sophie shuffled in, still half asleep in their borrowed nightgowns. Behind them padded the farm dog, Huckle, a border collie 6 years old, fur patterned black and white like ink spilled over snow. He moved with wiry energy and intelligent eyes that never seemed to stop calculating. Though new to the girls, he had quickly assumed guardianship, circling them with a protective instinct as natural as breath. Breakfast was plain toast, eggs, and a peach cut into quarters. Ruth had laid aside 2 oversized shirts once belonging to Clara, sleeves rolled and hems tied to fit the twins' smaller frames. Sophie wrinkled her nose at the unfamiliar scent of hay woven into the fabric. Emily asked if these clothes were for playing dirty. Clara smiled. "They're for living honestly," she said. And with that, she gathered them, Huckle trailing, and led the way outside. The barn door groaned as Clara pulled it wide. Sunlight pierced the interior through gaps in the boards, scattering golden shafts into the dusty air. The smells hay, manure, aged leather rushed out like blunt truths. The twins halted just beyond the threshold, faces scrunched. Sophie clutched her stuffed rabbit close. Emily lifted her chin as if bracing for battle. Clara crouched to meet them at eye level. "Listen, this place won't flatter you. It won't sing you lullabies or dress you in silk. But it will teach you something important. Here, you don't just exist. You belong because you help." She rose, placed a child-sized shovel in Emily's hands, and set a bucket in Sophie's. "Today's work: clean the straw, empty the water troughs, and sweep out what's left behind. We'll switch jobs halfway. This barn belongs to all of us, including you." In the far stall, Duke flicked an ear, as though affirming the lesson. Next to him stood Juniper, a Morgan mare barely 5 years old. She was restless, strong-limbed, a sheen of chestnut coat broken only by a white star on her brow. Her scar at the knee told the story of a fence jumped badly, yet her dark eyes gleamed with restless intelligence. She pawed the ground, testing, observing. The twins glanced at her warily. "She looks like she's planning something," Emily whispered. Clara chuckled. "She's planning to see if you're brave." From the rafters leapt Marigold, the barn cat orange, one ear notched, tail swishing with veteran pride. She padded toward the twins, brushed Sophie's shin with her side, then sauntered away as though to say, "You're new, but I will allow it." Sophie blinked, startled, but her lips curved faintly. Clara clapped once. "Let's begin." Emily attacked the straw pile with all the earnestness of a child determined to win. Her small arms hauled the shovel beneath the straw and yanked. The straw resisted, then surrendered explosively, showering Sophie with golden bits that tangled in her hair like a crown. For a frozen moment, Sophie's eyes filled with startled water, but then Emily's face-pale cheeks smudged with effort, mouth twitching, betrayed a suppressed laugh. And Sophie, catching her sister's expression, let go. A giggle burst out, unexpected, fragile but real. Emily followed with her own laugh, high-pitched and giddy, and suddenly the barn echoed with sound it had not known in years. Clara paused her own raking, stood still, and let the laughter work its miracle. Her eyes softened, relief mingled with triumph. "That's it," she whispered to herself. "That's how healing begins." Sophie carried her bucket to the trough, trying to mimic Clara's steady gait. But she stared too long at Juniper's watchful eyes, forgot her balance, and spilled water all over the hem of her dress. She gasped, expecting rebuke. Emily froze, waiting for tears. Instead, Clara bent, wrung out the fabric with calm hands and said, "It's just water." "The world doesn't end when we get wet." Sophie hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," she murmured. A small victory, invisible to most, monumental to Clara. Work continued, messy but sincere. Emily learned how to angle the shovel so the straw obeyed. Sophie discovered how to balance the bucket so it did not slosh like a mischief. Together they found a rhythm. When Emily bumped her head against the stall wall, Duke leaned down, exhaling warm horse breath over her hair before gently nibbling at the strands. Emily squealed in shock, then broke into unrestrained laughter. Sophie doubled over at the sight. Clara looked on, her heart swelling. They were not porcelain dolls anymore. They were children rediscovering joy. At the halfway mark, Clara called for them to switch. Sophie took the shovel, awkward at first. Clara guided her hands, teaching leverage instead of brute force. "Don't fight the ground," she said. "Ask it to help you." The next lift was smooth and Sophie's grin spread wide. Emily, meanwhile, handled the bucket with earnest concentration. The trough water shimmered clean for the first time that morning. From beyond the fence, unseen but very present, Samuel Harrington watched. Dressed in a navy sweater and tailored jacket that looked out of place against the dust, he leaned against the wood rail, his usually sharp hazel eyes softened by astonishment. He had expected tears, tantrums, rejection. Instead, he saw his daughters working, laughing, enduring small failures without collapse. His chest tightened. He thought of contracts and schedules, of marble halls and polished silver, and realized they had never produced this, never coaxed such smiles. He whispered under his breath, "They're alive here." The sound of a truck on gravel drew everyone's attention. Caleb Downs, the feed store owner, arrived with sacks of grain. Caleb was a man in his early 40s, shoulders broad beneath a canvas jacket, face tanned by sun, beard rough but neatly kept. His eyes were gray-blue, quiet, the kind that spoke of trust, built rather than declared. He greeted Ruth with a nod, acknowledged Clara with a familiarity born of long years, and smiled gently at the twins. "Looks like you've got yourselves some real workers." Emily ducked her head. Sophie half hid behind her shovel. Caleb, wise enough not to press, unloaded the sacks with easy strength. Huckle shadowed him like an apprentice, circling the truck bed. Before leaving, Caleb set down a crate of carrots. "For the horses and maybe the girls, if they're lucky." His voice carried a warmth that lingered after the truck rumbled away. Later, the mail carrier arrived, Eloise Pratt, compact, white curls tucked beneath her cap, steps brisk with habit. She handed Ruth the letters, joked about biscuits and responsibility, and gave Emily and Sophie each a sticker-tiny postal eagles. "You know," she whispered, crouching to their level, "stables are post offices for horses. Everything important passes through." The girls nodded solemnly as if given sacred knowledge. Eloise winked and continued her route. Back in the barn, Clara called the final task. She wiped an old chalkboard, wrote "Today's missions" across the top, and handed the chalk to Emily. Carefully, the child printed her name, then Sophie's. Clara added 3 words: water, straw, thank you. "What's the last one mean?" Emily asked. Clara only smiled. "You'll see." She gave them curry combs and guided their hands in slow circles across Duke's shoulder. The horse closed his eyes, leaning into their touch. When they were finished, Clara crouched, placed their palms against Duke's ribs, and stepped back. "Feel that? That's life. That's why we say thank you." Emily nodded solemnly. Sophie whispered the words against the horsehair like a vow. By midday, the chores were done. Fresh straw lined the stalls, the troughs gleamed with clean water, and the twins' faces glowed with both sweat and pride. They sat on the barn sill, munching apple slices Ruth had brought, legs swinging above the dirt. Huckle sprawled at their feet, Marigold curled like a loaf in sunlight. Juniper flicked her tail in calm judgment. Samuel, still at the fence, raised a hand. The twins, hesitating only a moment, waved back. Their father's heart lurched. It was a gesture ordinary to others, extraordinary to him. Clara stood at the doorway, her gaze fierce and tender. She looked at the chalkboard, at the laughter echoing, at the barn made holy by effort. She whispered, half to herself, half to them, "This is how you learn to love real life." And beyond the fence, Samuel dropped his shoulders, feeling for the first time in years that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for his family. The sun had climbed high, scattering the last of the mist, and the fields shimmered with heat waves. Cicadas shrieked from the trees, giving the farm a restless pulse. In the barn, the twins were wiping their damp hands on their oversized shirts, faces still flushed from the chores that had somehow become games. Emily's hair stuck to her cheeks in strands of straw-dusted gold. Sophie's dress hem was still damp from the water spill, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had survived a battle and earned a secret medal. Clara stood watching, arms crossed, her posture both protective and proud. She could already see how different they looked compared to the mansion lighter, freer, their eyes unburdened by constant shadow. Then the sound of footsteps broke the spell, heavy, deliberate, echoing off gravel. Clara turned her head first, but it was the twins who froze, their small bodies stiffening as if some instinct whispered that the world had changed. Samuel Harrington stepped into full view, no longer content to linger at the fence line. His broad shoulders filled the space, his tailored jacket too sharp for the dusty air. His face, usually composed with the detachment of boardrooms, was tightened into lines of fury. Hazel eyes, tired yet blazing, fixed on Clara with the weight of a verdict. "Enough!" Samuel barked, his voice cutting through the barn like a whip. Emily and Sophie jumped. Sophie clutched at Emily's hand. Huckle, the border collie, rose from his spot with a low growl, tail stiff. Even Duke lifted his head from the stall, ears twitching uneasily. Clara did not flinch. Samuel advanced a step, gravel crunching underfoot. "You had no right to bring them here," he thundered. "No right to drag my daughters into this place." He gestured violently toward the straw-strewn floor, toward the water-stained bucket, toward the horses whose calm eyes now followed the storm. "They are not stable hands, Clara. They are my daughters. My responsibility. Not yours to play games with." Emily's lips trembled. Sophie whispered, "Daddy?" But her voice collapsed under the weight of his anger. Their eyes filled, not with the playful tears of spilled water, but with the sharp sting of confusion. They had tasted joy for the first time in months, only to see it questioned, invalidated. Clara straightened, her dark curls gleaming with sweat, her voice steady but resonant. "They are your daughters, yes, and they are children. Children who have forgotten how to laugh because you've locked them away in marble halls, treating them like glass ornaments." Her tone sharpened. "You call this place beneath them, but it is life itself. Work, sweat, laughter that rises from dirt, not from porcelain floors." Samuel's face darkened further. "You presume too much. I've given them everything, comfort, education, protection. And you." His hand sliced the air, a gesture both commanding and desperate. "You dress them in rags and force them to scrub stalls. How dare you humiliate them?" Clara's eyes flared. "Humiliate them? Look at them." She pointed at the twins, whose cheeks were stained with straw, and whose breaths came fast with the effort of stifling sobs. "They laughed today, Samuel. They worked together, spilled water on each other, and instead of crying, they smiled. That's not humiliation, that's freedom." The barn felt too small for the storm. Ruth had come from the house, drawn by the raised voices. She hovered at the doorway, flowers still dusting her hands, her face etched with quiet concern. She was not one to meddle, but her gaze darted between Samuel's rage and Clara's resolve with something that resembled both fear and hope. Emily tried to speak, her small voice cracking. "Daddy, we like it here." But Samuel cut her off, his anger snapping back to Clara. "You overstep every boundary. I hired you to care for them, not to drag them down into the mud. You think grief gives you permission to play savior? It does not." Clara's chest rose and fell, her patience thinned but not broken. Her voice dropped lower, each word deliberate. You want to protect them, Samuel, but what you're really doing is imprisoning them. Do you want daughters who are alive, or dolls who sit quietly in a glass case? You can't have both. The twins clung to each other, trembling under the crossfire. Sophie's eyes brimmed, tears spilling down her cheeks. Emily bit her lip until it bled, as if determined not to cry, but failing anyway. Huckle pressed against their legs protectively, a silent barrier between them and the argument that threatened to unravel their fragile progress. Samuel's fists clenched, veins taut at his temples. He stood at a precipice, the safe harbor of wealth and image on one side, the uncharted waters of Clara's truth on the other. His breath came ragged, like a man cornered by something he couldn't buy or silence. The barn echoed with a stillness after his last words, a stillness that demanded a choice. Behind him, a new figure appeared at the edge of the yard, Sarah Whitlow, the schoolteacher who sometimes visited the farm to buy eggs. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with hair the color of wheat tied into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was pale, framed by freckles, and her green eyes carried both kindness and an edge of discipline shaped by years managing classrooms of unruly children. Life had hardened her gently. She had once lost her fiancé in a mining accident, a grief that had taught her to speak directly, never wasting words. She paused when she saw the scene unfolding, lips pressed thin, then quietly retreated rather than intrude. But her brief presence reminded Ruth and perhaps Clara that the world was watching, even if silently. Samuel's voice cracked like thunder one last time. They are my daughters, Clara. Not your projects. I decide their lives, not you. Clara took a step forward, eyes locked on his, her voice firm but trembling with emotion. Then decide, Samuel. Decide if you want them happy or just polished. Decide if you want daughters who know the world or ones who fear it, because you can't have it both ways. The barn held its breath. Emily sobbed openly now, burying her face against Sophie's shoulder. Sophie whispered something into her ear, though no one heard the words. Duke shifted restlessly in his stall. Juniper stamped a hoof. Even Marigold, the cat, leapt to a beam to avoid the tension heavy on the ground. Samuel's jaw worked, his throat tight with words he could not release. He looked at his daughters, fragile, tearful, yet carrying the faint glow of newfound courage. And he looked at Clara, unyielding, fierce, her voice echoing truths he had avoided for too long. For a long moment he stood between two worlds. The barn still smelled of dust and hay, the echoes of Samuel's anger lingering like smoke after a fire. Emily and Sophie clung to each other, their small hands trembling, cheeks stained with tears. Clara stood unbowed, her chest rising and falling, her gaze steady on Samuel as if daring him to choose between fear and love. Ruth remained at the doorway, silent but tense, flour still dusting her palms, her eyes pleading for calm. Even the animals had taken notice. Duke's tail flicked restlessly, Juniper pawed the ground, and Huckle crouched low, ears pinned, ready to defend if voices became more than words. Samuel's voice had faltered at the end of his tirade, and in that silence Emily found the courage to step forward. Her chin trembled, but her eyes, hazel like his, though softened by youth, held a quiet strength. She tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered first, then louder, "Daddy, I've never been this happy before." The words sliced through the barn like an arrow aimed at his core. Samuel froze. For years he had built walls of marble and glass, convinced that safety meant happiness. But here, in a drafty old stable, his daughter spoke a truth he could not deny. His throat tightened, but before he could respond, Sophie added her own plea, her voice quivering but certain. "We want to stay. Just one more day. Please." Samuel's shoulders sagged, as though the weight of years pressed down all at once. His hazel eyes darted from Clara's steady face to the twins' fragile hope. His anger, so quick to defend pride, melted into something raw regret. His late wife's voice seemed to whisper in memory, "They don't need castles, Sam, they need you." He dropped his gaze, exhaled, and finally nodded. "One more day," he murmured, the edge gone from his voice. The twins' faces lit like lanterns. Clara, though outwardly calm, felt her heart steady into triumph. Ruth slipped back toward the house, quietly relieved, and Samuel, with a deep, uneven breath, took the shovel from Clara's hand. "Show me," he said to his daughters, his tone softer, unsure but willing. Emily beamed, grabbing his hand and leading him toward the haypile. "Like this, Daddy." "You have to bend your knees," Sophie joined, giggling as she demonstrated with her tiny arms. Samuel clumsily mimicked them, his broad frame awkward in a task he had never considered worthy of him. The shovel bit into the straw. He lifted too much at once, spilling half onto his polished shoes. For a heartbeat, silence threatened. Then Emily erupted in laughter, Sophie followed, and to his own surprise, Samuel laughed too. A laugh rough with disuse, too loud, but real. The barn, once thick with tension, now rang with something purer than any scolding: joy. Clara stepped back, her arms crossed loosely now, eyes glistening. This was not victory for her, it was salvation for them. She watched as Samuel bent again, this time letting Emily guide his grip, Sophie patting his sleeve like a foreman satisfied with progress. Straw flew into the air like confetti, sticking to their hair and clothing, but no one cared. They were a family in motion, stumbling towards something they had lost and were just beginning to recover. Huckle darted around them, barking with excitement as if the barn itself had transformed into a festival. Marigold perched on a beam, her tail twitching with imperious approval. Even Juniper, sensing the strange energy, leaned her head over the stall door, blowing warm air onto Samuel's back. He turned, startled, then chuckled again, patting the mare's forehead. "All right, you too," he muttered, and Emily squealed at the sight of her father touching a horse with such clumsy tenderness. As they worked, a neighbor appeared. Walter Green, a wiry man in his 60s, stooped from years of farm labor but spry in spirit. His face was sun-leathered, his gray hair tucked under a frayed cap, and his eyes twinkled with the mischief of a man who had seen enough sorrow to know humor was its only antidote. Walter leaned on the door frame, chewing a toothpick, and said with a grin, "Well, I'll be damned." Harrington in a barn. "I thought I'd live to see many things, but not this." Samuel glanced up, half ready to snap, then surprised himself by smirking. "Don't get used to it," he said. Walter chuckled, tipping his cap. "Looks to me like your girls already have." He winked at Emily and Sophie, who giggled and waved, then shuffled off toward Ruth's garden patch, leaving the words hanging in the air like gospel. The rest of the morning unfolded in messy harmony. Samuel lifted, the girls directed, Clara occasionally corrected. Sweat dampened his collar, straw clung to his sleeves, and yet he did not retreat. Each misstep became another chance for laughter. Each stumble, a reminder that dignity meant less than presence. When the wheelbarrow was finally full, Samuel wiped his brow, leaning against the handle with a weary grin. "You two are tougher bosses than any board member I've met." Emily puffed her chest proudly. Sophie twirled with delight, her stuffed rabbit bouncing from her arm. Clara called a break, and Ruth appeared with lemonade in mason jars, the condensation sliding down the glass. They sat together on the barn sill, legs swinging in rhythm. Samuel sipped slowly, listening as Emily recounted how she had almost slipped, but Sophie had caught her, and how Duke had nearly stolen a piece of hay from her braid. Sophie chimed in with her version, embellishing every detail, her laughter punctuated by hiccups. Samuel listened, truly listened, and something unfamiliar tugged at him, an ache not of loss, but of return. Later, when the sun dipped low and painted the fields in amber, Samuel found himself walking with the girls through the pasture. Clara followed at a distance, allowing the space to be theirs. Emily picked wildflowers, Sophie tried balancing on fence posts, and Samuel carried both their treasures in his arms. For the first time in years, he was not the billionaire, not the widower. He was just a father, dusty and smiling, surrounded by the small chaos of daughters alive in their joy. That night, after supper of beans, bread, and fresh milk, Clara caught sight of Samuel lingering at the doorway of the twins' room in the farmhouse. He watched as Emily whispered a story to Sophie, their laughter muffled under blankets. His eyes softened in a way Clara had not seen since before Margaret's death. He closed the door gently, then met Clara's gaze. For once, no battle lingered between them. Only the quiet acknowledgement of a turning tide. Morning arrived over the farm, not in splendor, but in honesty. The mist had already burned off, leaving the pasture shining with dew and the air thick with the smell of cut grass and fresh soil. The roosters crowed late, as though reluctant to interrupt the quiet peace that had settled after yesterday's turning point. From the porch of the farmhouse, the sound of clattering dishes and the aroma of toasting bread carried outward. Inside, Ruth Miller worked at the stove with her usual matter-of-fact rhythm, her braids swinging against her back. She cracked eggs into the skillet, humming faintly, her shoulders no longer heavy with the silent fear that had lingered during Samuel's outburst the day before. Even she could sense that something had changed. At the wooden table, Samuel Harrington sat not as a tycoon, not as a grieving widower, but simply as a man among his children. His hair, brushed hastily, bore a stubborn cowlick. His navy shirt was rolled at the sleeves, as though he had accepted, if only for this morning, that neatness did not matter. Across from him sat Emily and Sophie, cheeks still rosy from sleep, their borrowed work shirts wrinkled but loved. Sophie's stuffed rabbit perched between their plates like an honored guest. Both girls leaned forward eagerly, laughter bubbling at the smallest provocation. They had shed the shadows of marble corridors and now wore the light of open fields. The table was laid with no ceremony. Thick slices of bread browned over the stove, a jug of milk poured straight from the morning's pail, scrambled eggs that smelled of butter. Ruth placed the skillet down with a clank, and the twins clapped as if it were a feast. Clara Johnson, who had been setting fresh jars of milk onto the counter, turned back with a faint smile. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had long since accepted responsibility as a second skin. Her short curls framed a face lined not by age but by resilience. Today, her dark eyes softened when they landed on the twins' laughter. Samuel watched his daughters shovel eggs onto their plates, Sophie dropping half onto the table and Emily snorting at her sister's clumsiness. Their laughter was contagious, pulling even a reluctant smile from his lips. For years, he had paid for fine china and towering cakes, banquet halls filled with servants, but none of it had brought this. The messy joy of breakfast eaten too quickly, the sound of giggles rising without permission. He tightened his grip on the fork in his hand, suddenly overwhelmed. Clara slid into the seat beside the twins, breaking her toast with her fingers. She ate with ease, unbothered by crumbs on the table. Samuel studied her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the calm in her posture, the quiet command she radiated. She had faced his rage without flinching, had challenged his pride without cruelty, and now she sat as though she had always belonged here. His throat tightened, the words pressing forward unbidden. He reached across the table, his large hand covering hers. Clara glanced up, startled, her brow furrowing slightly. His voice dropped low, almost reverent. "Thank you for giving me back their laughter." For a moment, the world hushed. Ruth pretended to busy herself at the sink, though her ears tilted back toward them. Emily and Sophie were too busy dipping bread into milk to notice. Clara studied Samuel's hand, rougher than she had expected, veins visible from years of work in different fields. Her own hand remained still beneath his, but her eyes softened. She gave the smallest nod, her smile faint but real. She had achieved her purpose. Breakfast unfolded in cheerful chaos. Sophie insisted that Huckle, the border collie, deserved a piece of toast. The dog devoured it, then leapt onto the porch, tail wagging triumphantly. Marigold the cat appeared next, pawing at Ruth's apron until she tossed a crumb onto the floor. Juniper nickered from the paddock outside, demanding her own share of attention. Emily announced grandly that today they should build a hay castle. Sophie declared herself queen of the barn. Samuel chuckled at their proclamations, his chest swelling with a pride he had thought buried with Margaret. When the plates were cleared and the table wiped, Samuel stepped outside with Clara. The field stretched golden under the early sun, the grass swaying in ripples like waves. The farmhouse, weathered but sturdy, stood behind them like a sentinel of memory and labor. Huckle darted through the grass, chasing shadows. The twins followed with shrieks of joy, tumbling over each other in the pasture. Samuel watched them, his face open, unguarded. "I used to think money could fix everything," he said quietly. "I built walls, bought silence, convinced myself they were safe. But I forgot. Joy doesn't live in mansions." Clara folded her arms, the breeze tugging at the hem of her shirt. Her voice was gentle but firm. "They don't need riches. They need roots, and someone willing to kneel in the mud beside them." She turned, her eyes searching his. "That has to come from you." For once, Samuel didn't retreat into defense. He nodded, gaze locked on the two girls who had collapsed into laughter, their faces streaked with dirt but glowing. He exhaled slowly, shoulders loosening. Then he looked back at Clara, something unspoken rising between them. He took her hand again, this time not in gratitude alone but in invitation. "Stay," he said simply. Not as an order, not as an employer's demand, as a man who had finally set aside pride to ask for partnership. Clara's lips parted slightly, her breath caught. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the absence of performance. She thought of the years she had spent shielding herself with discipline, the grief of her lost brother, the loneliness of carrying children's burdens not her own. And she saw the possibility of belonging, not just to a household, but to a family. She squeezed his hand once, lightly, and allowed herself a smile that reached her eyes. In the field, Emily and Sophie noticed their father and Clara standing together. Emily whispered something to Sophie, who grinned and shouted, "Come play, Daddy! Come play, Clara!" Their voices rose into the sky like bells. Samuel laughed, shaking his head. Clara rolled her eyes but let him pull her forward. Together, hand in hand, they walked toward the twins, toward the sound of true smiles carried on the morning wind. The farm had become more than a refuge. It had become a beginning. Sometimes we think happiness is hidden in big houses, fine meals, or expensive gifts. But this story reminds us that true smiles are found in simple moments. A child's laughter while holding hay, the joy of breakfast shared at a wooden table, the warmth of hands joined in trust. These are the treasures that money cannot buy, but love can create. In our own lives, maybe we don't need to build castles. Maybe we just need to sit closer at the table, listen a little longer, and choose to be present for the people we love. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below, tell me what part spoke to you most, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, family, and second chances. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may He guide your steps toward laughter that lasts. If you believe in the power of love to heal, write Amen in the comments as a prayer we can share together.